All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It's wonderful to see everyone here. Thank you so much. My name's Eliza Canty-Jones. I work here at the Oregon Historical Society. How many folks in the audience tonight are OHS members? Yay! I want to thank everyone for wearing green in honor of Portland Parks, which we're here for. We totally timed it this way on purpose, so thanks everyone. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about the Oregon Historical Society before I turn it over to our moderator, Judy Margles, because I want you to know that the mission of the Oregon Historical Society is to preserve our state's history and make it accessible to everyone in ways that advance knowledge and inspire curiosity about all the people, places, and events that have shaped Oregon. The work that we do here is additive. We are always uncovering new stories and finding new ways to ask questions of primary documents of the past. We don't erase or take anything away, and that's really important to us here. We're grateful for so much of the support that we get from the community. We are able to do things like have 3 floors of exhibitions here. We have school tours that come for free. We publish a scholarly journal, the Oregon Historical Quarterly. Our research library is free and open to everyone. So come on in with whatever question you have. The reference librarians will figure out how to answer it. We have online resources, the Oregon Encyclopedia, the Digital History Project, digital collections. There's a lot to explore here, and one of the best ways to connect with us is our weekly e-digest. So if you're not signed up for that, you can sign up on the email list in the back. So I am grateful, as I said, to our members and the many folks who support us, volunteers. I want to give a special shout out right now to Multnomah County residents who 3 times now have voted to enact a modest property tax levy that supports the Oregon Historical Society and 4 historical societies in East Multnomah County. Multnomah County voters will be asked again on the May election if you would like to renew that measure. That levy will not increase your taxes. It'll just keep them right where they are, and it'll allow us to keep doing right what we're doing. So Multnomah County voters, we hope that we have earned your continued support and that you will vote yes in that levy in May. The work that we do here at OHS relies on so many community organizations and so many community partners, and it really is because of the work of dedicated people, not only in the building, but outside the building, at places like the Portland State University Department of History, woohoo, PSU, and other partner organizations. The expertise that we have here in our community is incredible, and I'm really, really thrilled with all of the folks who are here to speak with you all tonight. So I'll introduce our moderator, and then she'll introduce everybody else, and then she'll ask them a bunch of questions. We'll have an opportunity for you to ask questions. And when you do that, one thing we do ask is that I'll come around with the microphone. Please do wait for the microphone to get there, because it'll help make sure everyone can hear your brilliant question when you have it. So Judy Margles, there at the far end, I'll give you this one and make sure that one's turned on. She is the Director Emerita of the Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education. During her 24-year tenure, she played a key role in the museum's growth, transforming it from a museum without walls into a series of rented spaces, ending with the 2014 merger with the Oregon Holocaust Research Center and the 2017 acquisition of a permanent museum location just north of here, about a 12-minute walk. Before her retirement in 2023, Judy oversaw an expansion that included the addition of a new gallery dedicated to human rights. Before her work at OJMCHE, she spent a decade as a curator at the Oregon Museum of Science and Industry, aka OMSI, and she is also the former chair of the Council of American Jewish Museums Board and has served on the board of the American Alliance of Museums. She is currently a board member of the Cultural Advocacy Coalition of Oregon and of Vanport Mosaic. She advises on museum projects for various institutions across the United States, and she is the curator of Roots of Democracy, Bernard Goldsmith, and the role of Washington Park in Portland's civic life. So please give a warm welcome to Judy Margles.
Thank you, Eliza, and I hope everyone appreciates Eliza. This institution would be nowhere near what it is today without her. So let's give Eliza another hand. Anyways, I'm delighted to be here. What I'm going to do before introducing our esteemed panelists, and everybody can hear me okay? And we're told we have to hold the mic really, really closely, so raise your hand if for some reason we start to do this. But I thought what I want to do first, before introducing our panelists, is just to frame the conversation a little bit. Don't know how many people actually had a chance to go in and take a quick look at the exhibit. Okay, but not all of you, so just to give you a little context. But our conversation indeed is inspired by this exhibition, The Roots of Democracy. The exhibit itself really explores the life and legacy of Bernard Goldsmith and the creation of what we know today as Washington Park. This year, indeed, it really does provide a meaningful moment for reflection, right? I mean, we're in such hard times, so I hope tonight we're just going to escape for a little bit from the world, the noise of the world, and just sort of enter this cocoon of thinking of something else. We are, of course, observing the 250th anniversary of the founding of this country, and we're also noting the 155th anniversary of the founding of Washington Park, right? These milestones encourage us to consider how democracy is shaped not only by national ideals, but also through local decisions, including how communities build and care for shared public spaces. Bernard Goldsmith's story begins far from Oregon. Born in Bavaria in 1832, he grew up in a society where Jews faced restrictions and limited civil rights. At 14, think about that. He was 14 years old. He left Europe for the United States in search of opportunity. After time in New York and California, he arrived in Portland in 1861 when the city was small but starting to grow fairly rapidly. Like many immigrants of his generation, Goldsmith built his life through enterprise and civic engagement. He ran a dry goods business, became involved in banking, transportation, infrastructure projects, and he quickly emerged as a civic leader. In 1869, what year was Oregon? What year did Oregon become a state? Here's your test. Yeah, so 10 years after the founding, after Oregon entered the Union, Portland voters elected Bernard Goldsmith mayor, making him the city's first Jewish mayor and among the first in the nation. During his tenure, he championed a bold idea that a growing city should invest in public space for the health and well-being of its residents. In 1871, so the final year of his mayoralship, he persuaded the city council to purchase 40 acres of rugged wooded hillside west of downtown, land many people thought would not be usable. He paid $32,000 for it, 1871. The city council thought this was so extravagant, so they did it, but they did it rather grudgingly. The purchase, of course, became City Park. That was the original name. That was the foundation of today's Washington Park, and one of the earliest steps in creating Portland's park system. Goldsmith's vision invites us to consider larger questions about cities and civic life. Who has the power to shape public space? What values guide these decisions? And how do places like parks reflect both the aspirations and the inequalities of the societies that create them? Tonight's conversation explores these questions using Goldsmith's legacy as a starting point, while also considering more broadly how parks have shaped civic life in Portland and what they mean for our communities today. So I'm very pleased to introduce our esteemed colleagues. After the conversation among us, as Eliza said, we're going to take questions from you. Jason Brown, this is Jason, is Programs and Partnership Manager at the Portland Parks Foundation, where he leads grant-making and community partnership initiatives. Trained in design and urban ecologies at Parsons School of Design, his work focuses on making cities more accessible and responsive to communities historically excluded from planning processes. Before coming to Portland, he worked as a community artist, organizer, designer, and cartographer. Dave Hedberg is principal historian at Outdoor Consulting in Portland. He holds a master's in history from Portland State University and specializes in environmental and Pacific Northwest history. His public history work includes cultural resource projects, documentary film films and interpretive programs for Portland Parks and Recreation, including From Stumptown to Treetown, a field guide for interpreting Portland's history through its heritage trees. Catherine McNeur is a professor of environmental history at Portland State University and the author of Taming Manhattan, Environmental Battles in the Antebellum City. Also, she is the author of Mischievous Creatures, The Forgotten Sisters Who Transformed Early American Science. Catherine is currently researching the history of Portland's parks, which is fantastic, and sharing that work with the public through digital platforms, including TikTok and Instagram. How many of you have actually seen Catherine's? Yeah, see, you've got it. They are marvelous. If you're not familiar, when you get home, you might want to look it up. So let's begin this conversation. And what I thought we'd do, I think we need to start on a personal note. I think that's always good. Parks often hold powerful memories for people, and those experiences really do shape how we think about public space. I'm going to start with you, Jason. Do you have a favorite park memory? And what made that experience meaningful to you?
Thank you. I have two, but I'll make them quick, and I hope I get extra credit because they're all located near Washington Park. The first is a personal one, which is more a kind of an ongoing experience. I love escaping to Hoyt Arboretum, which is just laced with these redwoods and old cedars that absorb all of the sound. So whenever you get there, you feel like you're having this intimate moment with the forest because it's quiet and it's dense and it's rich and it's really personal. So you can be there with a friend too, and you feel like you're in this lovely private room. Another is an embarrassing story that I'll share because I think humility is actually a value of democracy. And it's also up yonder. I was with a friend exploring Washington Park, and we were walking through an area that was paved, and I looked down on the ground. I was like, oh, what's this? And I tried to pull something up from the ground, and it was part of the Holocaust Memorial. And I had a humbling moment. I was like, oh, this is a discarded element that's part of this memorial. And it caused me to stop and reflect and see what was kind of intentionally put there as part of public art. So this moment of pause, reflection, and humility that I didn't know where I was, and it took a moment for me to recognize that.
So when I moved to Portland, I had a 3-year-old child. And so our first real introduction to the city's parks here were through his play dates with friends and through birthday parties that were being held in parks. And most of my favorite memories tied to parks are through my kids and the various events, and then the fact that we went to one kid's birthday party every year at Peninsula Park was formative. I see that park and I think of this one child's birthday party annual thing. But then also when the pandemic hit and playgrounds shut down, I live kind of close to Laurelhurst Park, and we were, the kids had been, the playground had been an anchor for my children. And then there are these low-hanging trees, or these trees with giant limbs that are on the top, the northern side of Laurelhurst Park, and those became the kids' playgrounds, where they were climbing on those trees and jumping around and doing that sort of stuff. And that's really a favorite memory. It's family memories, the layers of memories, and how you can kind of see your own history and community's history through these spaces.
So I also kind of have two, but they're connected. So Washington Park is really important to me, and growing up, I remember some of my earliest memories were, on the train up to the zoo, the Portland Japanese Garden, where my parents actually proposed. So I am a result of that. Very deep connection to the Japanese Garden. My grandparents would go there all the time. And so, yeah, I spent a lot of time going up to Washington Park with my family, having these memories. During the pandemic, I had a toddler, and I live across the street from Peninsula Park in North Portland. And so I spent a lot of time in that park, and it's actually where my son took some of his very first steps on the brick right next to the fountain. And so, those two parks have a pretty significant connection in my story and my family's history.
Thank you. And I hope you're all thinking of your first and most important memories in parks. And of course, personal experiences, they really remind us that parks are more than landscapes, right? There are places where we can have these experiences. They reflect, and they also reflect choices communities make about what matters, right? So Washington Park, it began as a bold experiment. I mentioned 1871. So the question is, what did creating a park at that moment reveal about how Portlanders understood civic responsibility, public investment, and a shared space in a growing city? And perhaps, Catherine, I'll have you start off with this.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in. So the fact that they were spending that much money on a park at a time when the city is pretty small in the 1870s. It's still pretty formative. There was a lot of question about what was Portland going to be. How did it compare to other cities? How was it comparing to San Francisco or cities back east? But, it was an investment in the future, really, because if you had a giant public space like that, it meant that you assumed that the city was going to grow, that it would grow into this, and that land was going to get more expensive, too, because it's about real estate, and it is an investment in land that the city is going to own and then have to manage, and there were all these questions about managing it and how nature should be controlled and what it should look like, and how people should interact with Washington Park specifically. But it is about this idea that we should be enough of a city to have a space, that more than the park blocks here, but a grander space that was comparable to Central Park or comparable to other cities that had big public parks that were becoming really quite well known for those city spaces.
Yeah, I think, I echo what Catherine was saying. It's also interesting to me, like at that time in Portland, with some of the early founders and settlers here, they're claiming land. And through this process of land claiming, people like Amos King, have very large land holdings. And so it's an interesting part of the story, too, of like where the land comes from that becomes parks. King could probably have held on to that and speculated and probably made a lot more money in the long run. So it's interesting, when you think about that moment of when those sales happen. At the time, it seems like a lot of money, but today, it doesn't seem like very much at all.
And actually, I'm sorry, I don't jump in. That happens at a moment where the park blocks were, there was all these debates with the Lounsdale family, the Lounsdale heirs, about extending the park blocks all the way up to the North Park blocks. And it's right at that moment when the city decides that they can't, that it's not going to be able to afford these blocks. The reason why the park blocks stop right here, and that's when they buy Washington Park, or City Park at that time. It's like at that same cusp of the moment of disappointment allows for the creation of a new park, far bigger and grander.
And of course, these early decisions about purchasing this park, they reflect larger decisions, right? Decisions about what cities should be providing for its residents. In the exhibition, we do ask the question, what makes a great city? The Olmsted brothers, of course, the Central Park Olmsted brothers, it was their son and stepson who laid out a city plan in 1903, and they argued that parks were essential to a healthy democracy. And the question is then, how have Portland's parks, and we can think of more than just Washington Park here, of course, but how have Portland's parks reflected the city's priorities, not just perhaps as places for recreation, but as spaces that can shape civic life?
I think, first of all, the fact that we have these really large parks is significant to me. I'm moving here from New York City, where there's a couple of very large, well-known parks, but otherwise we're really locked in the grid. And here within our grid, you stumble across a lot of small parks and some larger parks. So creating and establishing a place of beauty, respite, and kind of acknowledgement of nature is a grand value, I think, in itself in the city of Portland, this respect and reverence for nature. But I also think that we have come to use our parks in a lovely way as venues, not just values of themselves, but venues for cultural and artistic expression. And I see that as a pretty resonant value within Portland's understanding of what a great city is. How do we create spaces to continue to create together? And I think that parks end up being a really great venue as well as a value unto itself.
Can you say a little bit more, Jason, about the kinds of cultural events that you see happening in Portland parks?
Sure. I think, so I work for the Portland Parks Foundation, and one of my great roles there is as a grant maker to a lot of different events that happen in parks. So this really can range from musical experiences from different cultures. This can be murals, this can be dances, or just picnics, where it's places for people to connect. And I think what's really interesting is that all of this takes the creative initiative of the public. We are continually making together. So I think it's no one thing, but the fact that we have these spaces, I think, is essential.
I think also protests, right, are a really important part of some of the parks. We don't have we have a lot of parks that are devoted to different types of activities. So if I think of protests, I think of Lounsdale and Chapman over here, or the waterfront. And then, in 2020, they were more spread out, too. There was some in Peninsula Park and in Laurelhurst. There were different moments. But you see with the history of these protests in different eras, whether it's in 1890s or 1930s or the Occupy Portland or the 2020 George Floyd protests. There's tension around protests, right? So there's the protests actually happening and the speaking back at injustices or at disagreements about how things are going in society. And then there's also the attempts to contain that and to dedicate space to it, or to push people off of certain spaces or out of parks, or to close off parks and fence them off to make sure that they can't. I was just speaking with Ian, who's one of the organizers here, about Lounsdale and Chapman. In the prior to, in the at the turn of the 20th century, there were all these protests happening there. And people were upset about that. There were economic depressions happening, and people were protesting that, asking for more support and financial support and social safety nets and things like that. And Harvey Scott was really wanting people out of the parks. He was angry about these idlers and these communists and get them out and all this. And that is right at the cusp where the city decides to make Lounsdale and Chapman dedicate Lounsdale to only men or to men really, and to the Chapman was really only women and children. And that was, I believe, it was an attempt to get the grandstand, the people who are on the bandstand talking about this stuff, the protesters, the unhoused people who were sleeping in the park, who were lounging on the grass, to get out of that park. And so you see these tensions in democracy, that there's pushback, and then there's containment, and then there's more pushback, and it happens, it's really quite repetitive. And those parks specifically are at this really central place because of the courthouse and because of City Hall. So you see a lot of democracy speaking out there. Yeah.
I think there's another really interesting part of how these parks represent something in our society, and that was, have any of you read the Olmsted Plan for Portland parks? I see some heads nodding. Yeah. So it's it was a very bold idea, and if you read the plans, you kind of realize, wow, there was a lot more to the plan than what we actually got. And I like to remind people, go look at those plans and see what they were proposing back in 1903, 1905. Because what they're talking about is a lot of the parks that we have, but they're also talking about how to connect those parks through these connected greenways. And so there was really this idea that, parks began, on the streetscape, and people could walk and move to and from parks. And that was also part of the plan too. And in some ways we have that, but in some ways we've really struggled to do that with our green spaces and those interconnected parkways and boulevards. But I always like to remind people, go back to that document and look at what they were actually proposing. We just never really fully funded it. And this is kind of one of the old stories of Portland. We got great ideas, but we just struggled to get them fully funded.
So we know, just following up on that point, and something you, I think, started to allude to earlier, of course, the story of parks, it doesn't just begin with city planners or park commissioners, right? The land that became Washington Park has deep indigenous histories that long predate Portland itself. So what responsibilities do park systems have today in acknowledging, interpreting, and caring for this history? And I guess I think I'll just add an addendum to that. Are we doing it? Do you feel that the Portland park systems are acknowledging indigenous histories?
Yeah, I can jump in on that a little bit. It's a complicated question. And I think one of the things that we really have to start with is actually our own understanding of that history, and an admission that most of us probably need to unlearn a lot of what we have learned about indigenous history. So I think this is a very complicated space in indigenous history. There's many peoples that came through this area and that claim this area. And so it's important for Portlanders to understand the people of this place, the indigenous people of this place, and then it's also really important to also understand and acknowledge the indigenous people who are in this place. And so through this complicated history of this land, there are people that fit both of those categories and sometimes fit one of them or the other. And so it's really important for us to have a better understanding of indigenous history. And so I think there is an effort, and I see that in parks. There's an effort to be more inclusive. We always need more funding for these opportunities for people to practice their culture in the parks. And then there's also a real important acknowledgement of the many, many wrongs that have happened in parks and in park sites, and through monuments and depictions of indigenous people, which sometimes have been incredibly harmful, and program us to think certain ways. And so I think having this conversation at the Oregon Historical Society is a great place to kind of recontextualize and reframe how we think about this. So that's my 2 cents. Yeah.
I'll just basically piggybacking on what David just said. It's that you can't just talk about it in terms of prehistory. It can't just be a land acknowledgement, because then it kind of almost implies a vanished people, when it is what, as Dave said, the continuance of people, urban Indians, as living in the city, and people continuing to be part of these spaces, whether it's the American Indian movement protests happening in the 70s that you can find images of in the city archives, or the vagrancy laws that were pushing people out of city parks and back onto reservations, because if you couldn't work anywhere but the reservation, that you were going to be picked up by police and kicked out of the parks here. So it's a longer, more substantial history than something that can really simply be added to a sign in a park or a name of a park. It's the stories that have to be continue to be included in the histories of our city and the park itself.
Yeah, I would echo that. This is a work in progress, for sure. I think I was impressed recently with the city even renaming a park with a native name, native language, which I had to learn and get used to saying. I'm like, oh, okay, how to pronounce this? And that was a learning moment for me just with the renaming, which is, it's a marker. It's not the full story in itself, but it was a moment, again, of reflection. I also think that the key word here is continuity and community, that this is not just a looking back, but looking at the present and the future, not leaning on, but involving, including, and inviting Native communities to continue to partner with parks and community developments on their own time and own terms, and allowing the creativity to emerge from the community itself instead of coming with prescribed terms for how you can enter this partnership, but having a more broad base for understanding what partnership looks like, particularly with excluded communities, so they can participate, on their own terms.
Thank you. I think staying with this theme a little bit, of course, so even when parks are described as public spaces, access has not always been equal. And in fact, I'll just back up a little bit. When I had this idea, I've always known, working at the Jewish Museum, about Bernard Goldsmith and the fact that he did in 1871 talk city council into purchasing this land. And the idea for the exhibit actually came out of something that I thought would just be sweet and lovely, and what a great story to tell. But of course, there are inequities in our history all along, and very quickly, 1871, the park the land is purchased. It took a few years for the land to be, adapted so that people could go to it. The park, everybody knows where Washington Park is, up in the hills, where the more wealthy people lived. So it was a bit of a shock to me to realize that those living on the floor couldn't afford the streetcar, which was probably a nickel at the time. They couldn't afford to visit the park, right? So these inequities are just built into our history, right? So the question is, talk a little bit about these barriers, whether they're economic, whether they're physical, whether they're social. How have they shaped who feels welcome in parks? And I don't only want us to think historically, where do we see these inequities today?
It's a matter of environmental justice, right? So access and having neighborhood parks that are tied to, that are easily accessible to populations, whether or not there's a streetcar or just you have to bike there, whatever the case is, just having local parks. And there's been debates over the course of Portland's history about how close are the parks. And as soon as there were playgrounds over here in the North Park blocks, every neighborhood in the east side of Portland was fighting for playgrounds in their neighborhood and trying to get those kinds of the access for their kids to be able to access them without having to cross over streetcar tracks where the kids might get hit or things like that. So just locationally where these parks are going, and how it's being funded, whether it's a large park in a wealthy neighborhood or tiny pocket parks in less wealthy neighborhoods. And if you look at the maps of where Portland parks are, it's not equal. There are neighborhoods that don't have access to the same kind of green spaces that some of the older or wealthier neighborhoods have. So that's just like looking at a map from like a bird's eye view. But then actual access and surveillance in parks and feeling safe with policing and who is welcome and who feels immediately unwelcome. It's ranges, right? Park to park and moment in Portland's history to moment in Portland. Because any park is a microcosm of the city and any ills that the city is facing at that time. So if there's a drug issue, some people are not going to be feeling safe in certain parks. And then the policing is amped up in some neighborhood, and then other people are feeling themselves watched or surveilled upon. And there are parts of all these parks that have been specifically landscaped to be easily surveilled, to make sure that you could have enough lighting and enough, and that can make some people feel safe and makes other people feel unwelcome, right? All the rules that go into parks. There were issues with the hippies of Lair Hill or the hippies moving into Lovejoy Fountain and getting kicked out and curfews being instituted. So there's all these moments where things are being shaped, and who are these parks for is a constant question, and who are being defined. And if you walk into any park, there's rules, right? You can do this, and you can do that, and you can't do this. And it's a social contract, but it's also, and sometimes it has a long history behind why those rules are there.
If I could just ask a quick question. Are cameras allowed in parks today?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Like you can use cameras in parks.
But you meaning like CCTV kind of thing?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Surveillance. I'm not
I
aware.
don't know.
I'm not aware of any.
My sense, just from as a park user, is just not. I think it's just lighting, right? I think that's primarily and landscaping.
But this
Hopefully.
this
I don't
came
know.
up in some oral histories we did with parks people in northeast Portland, and so they were talking about their experiences as parks employees in the 80s and the 90s, and at that time there was a policy in certain parks in north and northeast Portland where parking was not allowed around the park, and that was because the police wanted to be able to see what was happening in the park. Well, many of the folks that we were interviewing were from the black community, and they were saying, they were having to drive to some of these parks for social gatherings, and they couldn't park near the park. And so that was in and of itself like a barrier to access the park. And so, a lot of folks found new parks where that policy wasn't on the books or it wasn't being enforced. And so just these ways of like creating a rule might have some unintended consequences with some of the communities that are using the park. Just an example.
Yeah, I would jump in and just say I think a lot of the barriers are better understood as gaps. So sometimes barrier kind of summons a vision of like a big castle wall, but there's also big castle moats around some of these parks as well. And those are gaps in levels of service. So if you can't get to a park within a 10 to 15 minute walk, how is that really your time to connect with nature if you got to get on a bus, ride 35 minutes to get to a place, find the actual entrance to the trail, and finally get into the park itself? So I think there's some work we have to do on levels of service. And then another gap or kind of invisibility that I think we could do some work on making visible is activations, because activations in parks are the ways that folks see them used and used by people like themselves, perhaps, right? So who's activating the park? Who's getting the permits to do the things in the parks? We do our work as best as we can at the Parks Foundation to get grants out to groups that really represent our diverse cultural communities here in the city, but that's really a great way for you to bring you and your community into the park is do an activation, whether that's just a community day, a performance, or whatnot. That starts to bring down the barrier of, is that park really for me at all? Invite your folks to that park and make it yours.
And do people tend to use parks in their own neighborhoods? Or I know, Catherine, when I heard you speak a couple of weeks ago, you were talking a little bit about Washington Park and that a lot of people don't go to Washington Park because of its location. So I don't know if you...
Yeah, I think that we have a lot of different parks that hold a lot of different purposes, right? And so Washington Park, I feel like there are people who live right there and go frequently or work there, and then there are people who take their guests from out of town there to go to the Japanese gardens or to Hoyt Arboretum or to the zoo. And that park is very, there's a lot of roads through Washington Park, right? And so it's very car-centric. There's a ton of parking within the park itself, so much so that the MAC trails, like the Multnomah Athletic Club folks, like put in the trails in there to make it more welcoming to pedestrians to walk through the parks. I think they did that in the 90s. So I feel like, people do use it or go hike at the Wildwood Trail there and through Forest Park. But I think there are a lot of local parks that people maybe use on a regular basis or they go explore things too. So it's always a mix. But we have such a wide range of tiny and enormous parks that are used in such different ways that you might take some guests that are really great hikers to Forest Park or to Mount Tabor, and then you might take the family who's from out of town with little kids to the zoo, or whatever the case is, or to the playgrounds at the Elephant House. It just kind of depends what your purpose and what time of the week and what you have time for, I think.
Is Washington Park the only park in Portland that has private spaces in it or places where you have to pay to enter something? Japanese Garden, the zoo, World Forestry Center?
We have the Leach Botanical Gardens also. And Portland used to have a ton of these private pleasure grounds. Even in the 1870s, if you look at a map, you'll find them dotted all throughout the city. It's basically people who had all these large property owners who weren't selling their property would turn it into a private park, basically, where you'd pay a small fee and then go in to have a picnic. So there's a long history of that, and that's not just Portland. That's a national phenomenon, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century.
So I guess digging down a little bit into the idea of who gets to use a park, how do we actually thread the needle that we have parks that have spaces that are expensive to enter?
That's about public funding, right? And if the Japanese garden or the Leach Botanical Garden had enough public funding, then maybe they wouldn't have to charge as much to allow for the maintenance. I don't think they're. I would like to assume that they're not doing it to be exclusionary. It's just about bottom lines, and yeah.
And also, park assets are just very expensive things. I think that's one of the barriers too. There's this kind of invisible barrier around maintenance, which is we have these beautiful assets that are going unmaintained, so we're actually losing them. And that degrades kind of the livelihood of the city overall because of the maintenance backlog. I don't have a solution right here about that, but I think it contributes to kind of what upholds this value of having parks as people's places. Well, they need to be accessible and well maintained, and that changes over time what that looks like, right? How do we actually create access when we learn better about who and how people can access them, or who and what we want to see kind of put on in parks? That changes how we should build them and maintain them.
Okay, a great segue to get into the area of discussion that I'm sure you're all waiting for. Parks tell stories, right? But they tell stories not only through landscapes, but through the memorials and monuments. And for those of us who lived through the summer of 2020, we're all very familiar with the issue of monuments. So the parks throughout Portland, Washington Park, they have monuments that were erected in different eras. And the question really is, what do these monuments, what do these memorials, what do they reveal about how Portland has told its story over time? How should park leaders respond when earlier interpretations feel incomplete or exclusionary?
So, right across the street, like right behind you all, is the Teddy Roosevelt statue that came down on Indigenous Peoples Day in 2020, right? So I think, you could tell that story of just that monument as like an old school way of telling that story. It would be like, okay, here is the sculptor, and here is Coe, what's it? I can't remember his first name. Harry, yes, thank you. Dr. Coe, who paid for all these monuments around town, and he's a complicated figure. Someone needs to do some real serious research into that guy, because he had a hospital where he was getting indigenous people from Alaska, anyone who was taken off the streets with, basically, if they were mentally ill, they couldn't be. Anyway, it's complicated. That's a story. He went to Congress. There are all these things going on. There's a lot of anti-Indigenous stuff going on there, too. It's very complicated. Somebody needs to tell that story. I'm just seeding that story, because I've been trying to get students to tell that story, and it's if you start doing a Google book search for his name and Morningside Sanitarium, I know there's some grad students from University of Oregon back here, look into this. In any case, so there's that story. And then there's Teddy Roosevelt, who has this quote from the 1880s. He was like, I wouldn't say that any dead Indian is a good Indian, but 9 times out of 10, that's true. Something terrible, right? Teddy Roosevelt's a complex guy. He does a lot of good. He does a lot of bad. And we have this statue, and it comes down on Indigenous Peoples Day. And when we had the art exhibit in 2022 at the Portland Art Museum, I'm forgetting the name of the artist right now. Does anybody remember? There's a wonderful photograph of them perched, Indigenous artists, group of people perched on top of the platform. How do we tell that story? We have to tell the layers. We have to tell the early, tell the ugly, keep the ugly, and that's our history too. That's it's looking at us in a bad light, yes, and looking at the layers of history about what, there are people who love TR, there's people who hate TR, like whatever, just tell it all. Can you do that in one simple site interpretation? I'm not sure, but it's important to have the layers, I think. I think he's being reinstalled. I don't know the whole story I don't have my finger on the pulse of, maybe you all know more about, but I think it's being reinstalled with new signage or something like that. But yeah, it's none of these statues. The coming of the white man is a particularly ugly one in Washington Park, but most people don't know where it is. If you look on a map, sometimes it's not there on the maps of Washington Park. So yeah, and that statue was beloved by the Parks Bureau for a long time. It was in a lot of annual reports about how great it is to have this dedication to the vanishing Indian, all this sort of stuff that we roll our eyes at now, generally, we hope. But it was a way that it was celebrated in the early 20th century. So it's all complex, but yeah. But memorials are of a moment. I'm a historian, right? So I like, kind of looking at these layers. But at the same time, like, there are moments where we are celebrating certain people and celebrating certain things. And then there are moments where we take those things away because we're not celebrating them. And that's not unique to the United States at this moment. There was, like, Augustus's head was found in the sewer in Rome, right? Like, and that's, like, from the 2,000 years ago, whatever. Like, there's been a long history of you take the monuments down, you put the monuments up, you reinterpret. It's part of human history and making sense of what we're celebrating at any given moment.
I've been thinking a lot about monuments through my work, but I'll take my work hat off and just been thinking about it personally as well, that it's funny that these monuments, and some public art as well, are this interesting juxtapositions of solidness and severity amidst a landscape of change and beauty and softness and seasonality. And it's strange to me that we regard these we revere them with such respect when they're surrounded by an entirely different story, which is change. And not that the monuments need to change maybe every season or every year, but we do need to figure out how to utilize this powerful thing that we can do as humans, which is change the story, create a better context. How do we weave that into these steely things that we have placed in this landscape that is eternally telling us a very different story, which is we can blossom, we can rot, we can seed, we can grow, we can move. And these aren't moving things. And it's very strange that we set them in these landscapes. Maybe it's the juxtaposition that makes them beautiful or interesting or something like that. But I think it is a little curious that it's such in disregard of the landscapes that they're set into, that there's this spirit begging for change.
Yeah, I think it's like those materials that they're cast from. They lend themselves to this idea of permanence. And I encourage you all to really dig deep into that and think about how do you interrupt that permanence and think about these things as fluid stories. One of the things I do, have any of you ever seen the beaver boards? They're another form of monument. They're like on the side of the highway. They're these wooden carved beaver signs. So I'm on a committee and we look at those beaver boards and we help draft them. So we're creating monuments, but in a way they're constantly needing to be revised because the materials that they're created out of over time will rot. And I find it to be a helpful metaphor to remember that when we are creating a monument, it is of the time that we're creating it. And that moment isn't going to last forever. And so, yeah, remembering that when you're looking at something, it had power in its time. It was created for a reason. It has a complex history. It served a purpose. What is that purpose? We're often not asking that today. So, dig deeper. Think about this history and these monuments in fluid ways. And again, it's good to have that conversation in this space, in a historical society, where we can think about time in time and recognize the time that we're in today.
So what is our obligation to visitors to the park who are looking at this statue of Sacagawea or the coming of the white man, or bless him, Harvey Scott, when he was at Mount Tabor? Do they need to be reinterpreted? Do they need to be removed at this point?
I think certainly reinterpreted or revisited. I was just thinking, I'm bookended by historians, so I'll leave you to the storytelling, but I think about when I'm trying to listen to a story, I don't want to just be looking up and have it yelled down at me, which is what a lot of the statues, the monuments have us do, is they would say, I am delivering a message unto you. So I'm curious how we can reinterpret our monuments as storytellers themselves. When I do that and I want to spend time with a friend in the park telling me a story, I want to do it on a level plane, and maybe we're sharing something together. And I'm curious if we can reinterpret these entities as they are, as things that are more parallel with our social plane rather than kind of delivered from above. So certainly some reinterpretation. That's a de-ascension in some cases, I think, but I think it's also a creative recontextualization. I know at least one of the statues is being lowered, I think, from like a pedestal to be a little bit more in line with the human eye. And I think we have to be more creative with what are we hearing from these pieces, and how do we want to hear it?
I think you'd like the Vera Cat statue. That's on the east side. Yeah. That is definitely on eye level. Yeah. I don't know the answer to this question. I think it's going to be one that we continue to wrestle with, and like how, what public historians do to increase site interpretation and bring in new ways of, whether it's a QR code. I don't know if that's right. I don't know, or like some kind of app, but then you're on your phone. I don't know what the answer is, but you just need layers of history. If it's going to stay there, you need to bring in some kind of storytelling that ends up being something more than the statue itself being the only thing telling the story. Because if it's just the coming of the white man or whatever, then it's not necessarily a great story. The Holocaust Memorial is a great example of a layered story, like where you can go in and you can read quite a bit and really kind of contextualize yourself and Oregon's Holocaust survivors. There are different ways that the more recent memorials and places have really done that work too.
I think the recontextualizing them is really important, and that greater interpretation is really important. But I have significant concerns that, panels get pulled down. People say, oh, let's put up some more panels and let's reinterpret this. The next regime comes along and those panels come down. QR codes are great. Websites get taken down. We're in a time where ephemeral interpretation may be more accessible to people, but it's also very, very quickly cold and deleted. So I think it's a very difficult conversation. I've done some travel in the world, and you see how other countries deal with this. In the former Soviet Union, they take their statues and they move them out to a new site, and they create an outdoor, sculpture park where you can go. These monuments have been moved to a new place. Everyone can see them. They can be interpreted in that site, in that new context. And I think that's, an interesting approach. Something that perhaps could happen in a place like Portland. That's just my opinion. I don't hold any of the power to make any of these decisions, but as a historian and a public historian, that's one that is intriguing to me because it decenters the permanence and the power that these symbols were put there for.
I had, and I know Dave worked on this project too, but a couple of years ago I had my students partner with the Friends of Peninsula Parks Rose Garden and work on a new interpretation. They have one sign in the park, or they had, I should say, this was a long time ago, one sign in the park in 2020 that was at the Rose Garden, and it was primarily a white history of a very diversely used park. And my students created a zine, right? And now that lives on a website, and that website may, how long can we pay for the, there are questions, right? But at the same time, there was ways that the students made a zine, they did all this research, they reinterpreted the history of the park, moved it north into the park to tell a primarily African-American story of the community center and the people working there. They combined their efforts, created a zine, and it was a digital thing, and then it was a printout, and they put it in free libraries all over the place, so that the kind of spreading the word in that kind of public history way to do that work, and the students were just leading that effort in a great way. And then I think Dave took on the realm afterwards and did all these oral histories of people in the park too, and then creating a collection that can then be used by historians and other researchers, anybody, to go into these beautiful archives and get to listen to these different stories too. So there's so many different ways that we can continue to reinterpret parks and really uncover the powers of these spaces, but also the layers and layers of history that's often not as recorded.
But what I'm really gathering from what you're saying is the best way to do this, go to the parks. Talk to people at the parks, right? What you're saying, we don't need QR codes, we don't need websites, we don't need interpretive plaques up the gazoo. We just need to be looking and talking, right? Because that is a way. I have one more question I'm going to ask, and then I have other questions, but I'm hoping you have questions. I want to make sure they're time. So it's a forward-looking question. It's an important question, but, you're so knowledgeable about the history, the meaning of parks in Portland, parks around the country. So what do you hope visitors will think differently, how they're going to think differently the next time they go to a park? What do you want visitors to parks to come away with?
I would say that it's not just about the Olmsteds or the founding ideas about parks. It's about the ways that all of us as Portlanders and the generations that have come in between continue to remake these spaces and to make history there, that the child's birthday party counts as part of that history as much as the erection of a statue or whatever. Like that, these are layers of histories, and they should all be considered as part of the story. That we'll never know all of the stories, but we can keep asking new questions of these spaces and tell new stories about Portlanders through these spaces too.
Yeah, I'd like people to think about, every brick, every tree, every flower, is touched and shaped by individuals. And if we start thinking about these parks as a reflection of our society and as individuals, you can have an appreciation for your fellow humans, your fellow community. And so nothing is here by accident, and we're all connected through these spaces, so we should start seeing each other's history in these spaces. And, I think when I go to Peninsula Park, I see, 16-year-old girls having their quinceañera, a Native American drumming group, a group of Ethiopian immigrants out on a family picnic. I'm seeing people that are part of the story of Portland, and I'm realizing, there's some part of this city and this city's history that I need to learn more about. I see who is in my community when I go to the park, and it informs me on what I need to know and learn more about being a Portlander.
I'm going to echo both of your points. I think two words that come to mind are continuity and contribution. One is continuity, that you're never starting at zero, whether you're new to the park. There has been so much put into it already, so much like what Dave was saying. Hands at work, stories, ecologies at work. That grass has been growing for, never mind grass. Those cedar trees have generations behind them. So can you imagine how much you're actually in this grand network of stories that are happening in the park? So I hope folks can kind of pause and think about this continuous story of growth and change that's happening in the park, but also contribution, that these spaces really need attention and care for them to to continue to the next generation that happens through volunteer work? How can you not just observe but participate in this park? How can you contribute back to it? It's a gift to you from previous generations of taxpayers and volunteers. You can also be one of those to bring it into the future. So sign up for a volunteer position today.
And before we're going to get to questions, but of course, I just want to bring us back to where we started with this immigrant, 14 years old. I should say that we think he was about 5 feet tall, which I like because that's my height. And if you see him in here, our designer made him 5'4" for the show because we felt that was more appropriate. But it is, as well, it is what an immigrant can do, frankly, right? This 14-year-old who left his family in Bavaria and traveled to the United States, started in New York, worked his way around across the country, became the mayor of Portland, and then had these dreams and ambitions. He did a lot more than this park. He also started the navigation locks in Oregon City. He was one of the founders there. So it's a really wonderful story. Okay, questions from you. Eliza's gonna.
And you can take selfies with Bernard and post them. Oh, yeah. Tag us in with your selfie. Oh, I see. Way in the back. Thank you. Yes. So often.
Thank you for your historical and philosophical perspective on parks. I'm curious about whether there's an overarching philosophy of play in the parks, because my grandson complains that at school they can't run on the playground. They have special surfaces on the playground. They can't climb on the monkey bars. And when I think of parks, I think of the risk versus adventure. And I'm curious to know, is there some overarching philosophy of play? Is that something that we as a community can contribute to in conversation? Because, I mean, if we're going to get kids to get outside in the first place, we need to let them have fun.
I don't think there's a long-standing, like, don't go and play or risk yourself kind of philosophy here, because if you look at old photos of playgrounds here, they're pretty dangerous. Like, they're pretty rough. There's like a ladder to nothing, or things like that. It's just very dangerous looking stuff. And even like Westmoreland Park has the adventure playgrounds that came in the early 2000s or 2010s. Like, so I think there's an embrace of some of that. Like, you can still break your wrist on a playground. I'm sorry that your grandson has that experience. So I don't think that's a long-standing philosophy. I think there's been acceptance of risk, even supervised risk, but still risk on these playgrounds.
I'll just add really quick. My son goes to Chief Joseph Elementary School, which is right next to Arbor Lodge Park. And that's where Harper's Playground is. So this is an ADA compliant, accessible playground. And my son will tell me, like, during his recess, he is not allowed to climb the trees. That's a school policy. When he's out of school and he's in the park, he can climb the tree if he wants. There's no one telling him to stop him, especially his father. So there might be some, parks horticulturalists that aren't too pleased about it, but he enjoys that park, and I think there's a lot of ways to play in parks. I think a lot just depends on your experience and, maybe who's supervising your play.
I am very interested in third spaces, and I would love to hear you speak a little bit, instead of the kind of historical relevance of parks, even though I know we're in the Historical Society. Would love to hear you talk about your vision or how you see Portland's parks as part of a vision for third spaces, getting people to interact with community in those spaces. Thanks.
I'll jump into that. I hesitated to use third spaces. Sometimes it's overused for kind of cafes as this space, but that's a space that you have to purchase something, or at least have a play at purchasing something to arrive there, and parks are not, libraries are not. And there are really limited spaces where you don't have to purchase something to belong. And I was thinking, actually, as I was reviewing this history of, there's, well, at its best, there's a classlessness to parks because you can show up wearing whatever you want, however you want to be in that place to meet up with whoever you want to meet up with. So there is this opportunity to show up as is and outside of your place. So there's a real openness there. I had maybe more thoughts, but they ran away.
No, I agree. I think parks should be in the ideal, right? Are kind of like the ideal third space or democratic, if we're going to the name of the exhibit. A democratic space where everybody you can witness a lot of different Portlanders, as Dave was describing, and Peninsula Park too. It's not always been historically. I was just, when you were talking about like you could wear whatever you're wearing, I was like thinking about the 19th century and people would like tip their hat or not if you're on the promenade, if like depending on your outfit, and if you're I don't know. There are a lot of like rules at different moments in history, and if you look at old pictures of Washington Park, it's often like, I don't know, the social media of the 19th or the early 20th century, where it's like people really dressed up by the fountain, and it's kind of like showing off your children by the Owl House, and their best clothes. So there have been moments, but I think that is the ideal. One of the more idyllic images of parks that I can think of is going into Laurelhurst Park on a summer evening and finding the random ad hoc circus going on, as well as people picnicking and someone kind of doing a tightrope sort of thing between trees, and just kind of somebody playing a guitar and offering tarot readings in a different corner. Like all these kind of random bits of Portland that are happening, not a barbecue, but like picnics and people coming in with birthday parties and whatever. I think that's the best part of a third space, is to be able to witness so many different people, not just the people with their laptops and their coffee cups at Crema or something like that. Although I love Crema, but really anybody who can walk into these spaces for free and not have to pay for anything, as long as it's not pouring and they're whatever.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm curious, where in the world are parks existing in a more ideal state? What separates them from our current state? And then what impact on society are we missing out on by not being in that state?
Okay, I don't know. I'm not sure that they have like a perfect global comparison. But I think we actually have a really good system. I don't know. Like, I actually really think that Portland, I don't know. I'm seeing some nods. I don't mean to be like an exceptionalist. I'm not like, oh, Portland is the best and there's nothing better that we can achieve or try to achieve. Of course, there's always more public funding that we could get for our public services and community houses and things like that. But honestly, we fund these spaces. We celebrate these spaces. All of you turned out for a talk on Portland parks. Like that we have a foundation that continues to fund it too. I think there are ways that we can continue to fund it. Like let's save the Leach Botanical Garden. Let's do things like that and come out, but approve bond measures. And I think but otherwise I truly do think there are always ways that we can improve to make people feel more at home in these spaces and not as surveilled, and more people welcome. But whenever there's going to be a problem in our society, we'll see that come up in parks too. I don't know. So I'm not sure that I have a perfect idea of where someone is doing it better than us.
This is Peak Parks here. No, I think that's a great answer. I don't have any other places that come to mind, but I do think, we have some pretty key indicators that Portland does parks very well. I think just personal story was when I was visiting here, moving here from New York, which has, again, a few giant parks and many little parks. But I was able to get into the middle of Laurelhurst and actually feel like I had escaped the city. So I feel like an ideal that we can look forward to is more places where you can truly feel like you've just disappeared off the grid. I can even get that in like Alberta Park, which I think I appreciate a lot because that park's not very big, but you can have a moment where you're like, oh, where am I? Oh, I'm in the forest? I was just, 2 minutes away from the street. So this is actually just Portland boosterism, but right here, this is where you can get the ideal park.
I'll just add, one thing we can do is better fun things. And as a kid, as a parent of a kid who's trying to get into swim lessons, in North Portland, if there's any city commissioners here, we really need more pools. So I think there's very specific things that we can get to. But I think in general, in the big picture, we're doing a really good job. But I think specifically, we can do a better job of funding things.
Thank you for this conversation. I was wondering if you guys could say a little bit more about what the founders back in the day that started this, what did they get out of it? Because as you pointed out, land was valuable. And just thinking about the race and class divisions at the time, it's hard to imagine they were like, let's just be nice here. So were they trying to project largesse? Was it like being a big, important city? I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, there's like a lot of different philosophies that went behind parks early on, especially, and sometimes it was largesse, but it was, it's like a merit badge to show that you're a big city. So that's one. It's like city beautiful movement. It's like you have to have monuments, you have to have boulevards, you have to have big parks, and that's a way to show that your city is modern. And that's right at the cusp of when the Olmsteds are coming in. There's public health issues. So your idea that if you're going to have a healthy city, you need to have these spaces where people can breathe, where there's like, and we still kind of appreciate that, like as it was seen in COVID, where you can get outside and be 6 feet apart or what have you. But even back in the day, it was seen as a way to have a breathing space in the city that would counter industrial centers in the city too. And then you see also real estate. I mean, this is the most cynical view of it, but that's what really funds a lot of it, is that real estate. The properties around parks, they jump up, and that ends up filling the city coffers by raising property taxes. And so there's a benefit of gentrifying a neighborhood by having a park there. If you look at old real estate ads in Portland, they're often tied to the fact that a park is in a neighborhood, so therefore you want to buy a lot there so that you're going to live in a great neighborhood, and it's going to be, your values will only go up. And the city wants that too, so they're going to be promoting it that way too. But then there's also the largesse part of it is like the playground movement really was about helping poor kids. There's a counter side to that where they're like, we don't want these poor kids to grow up to be thieves and prostitutes, and so we're trying to save the morality of the city by getting them on play structures that maybe is a ladder to nowhere or whatever, but it's still, a structure to get them active and off the streets. But that's where you kind of see the early parks movement in Portland is like a combination of all those factors, like health and real estate and the merit badge for the city and helping kids and the poor and things like that. Is it perfect? No. Were these ideally for every single Portlander at the time? No, but people took up space. They made it their own, and you see, Chinese Portlanders and Japanese Portlanders taking over the North Park blocks and really trying to show that they are Portlanders. And that's true throughout the city for different immigrant groups at different moments too. So people have the founders or the city leaders or the elite of the city at that moment might have an idea, but they don't have control, and so parks really take on their own way because of that, because Portlanders make it what they are.
My question briefly is, when did it start that Portland did not want to provide dollars for the long-term maintenance of its parks?
think when didn't it start? I think that there's always there are always moments where people are like, "This is going to cost too much." I think there's always budgetary issues, whether you're looking at the 1880s and people debating how to fund City Park / Washington Park, or in the 1970s with maintenance of parks. So I don't know that that's a new. I think that's just a long-standing issue.
Yeah, I would say go to the Olmsted plan, and you'll see it right there. It's like, this is what we need, this is what it's going to cost, this is what we got. And that's, if we're going to start with the Olmsteds in 1903, I think, yeah, it's been ongoing.
I appreciated your discussion about memorials. I spent over 25 years of my life working for Portland Parks, and I did lots of different things, but one of the subspecialties I had was memorials. And in fact, I worked with a group on the first memorial policy, because what nobody in this room knows, there's probably a book there somewhere about all the memorials that did not get built. It's amazing being on the inside how many people look at parks as open space, and I always believed there was a little bit of turf issues, like they wanted to make a statement and make a stand. And so there's a lot of memorials that did not happen, like the Lady Di Memorial, and I could go on and on. But I wondered if you had a reaction to that there's some bit of wanting to leave a legacy or make a statement or have some public space that you didn't pay for.
Yeah, I mean, well, like the Coe stuff, he paid for so many memorial because he was just wealthy. He had so much money, and so he built the TR. He did the Joan of Arc at Coe Circle, right? He did Lincoln also. I think Washington, I'm not sure about Washington, that's out near the German-American. Yeah, so it's like sometimes, and that's before there was a monument policy. Obviously, if you were here, like if you wrote the first one, then like clearly it was way before. But because of that, like it ends up being a power play. It's like who has the money to donate this stuff, and then what statement are they making? And it's not necessarily like there was an art commission who was approving or all that sort of, it's not, or maybe it was like one commissioner who like let it happen. I think that is a good book idea, though. The monuments that weren't put up, as well as the monuments that did go. Like, I think that's actually a really good idea for a book.
So I think we have time for one more question. Eliza will choose. Two more quick questions. Make them quick.
Can you just talk about lost elements? For instance, I wish I could have ridden the roller coaster at Council Crest. And the bathroom that we now know as Witch's House in Forest Park. Can you talk a little bit about lost elements in parks?
That's a historian question.
I mean, I think that's all true. Like the Witch's House, and I mean, in some ways, the ruins are delightful too. And there's a lot that's lost. But the Owl's House in Washington Park, like where the original zoo had been located. There's some photos of that, which are really, Judy, is there a photo in there? There's a photo in there, so you could go check it out in there. But it's a beautiful structure, and when it was torn down, I think in the 1960s, it came down rather fast, and it was right at the cusp when historic preservation was really taking off, and local historic preservationists got like super upset about that. It ends up being in the newspapers. But that's, there are a lot of lost little changes that we can only really know now through archaeology and then also through photographs, which is too bad, but then it's kind of nice to see these layers of history in whatever way we can. So.
This is personal, but if you go down to the waterfront, there's the tower of the battleship Oregon. This was something that was really important to my grandpa. He was in the Navy, and when he was a kid, he helped save money. And this was something that Portlanders did, is they all collected their coins to try and save the battleship Oregon, because they wanted to have it down at where the amphitheater is now, where like the blues festival is, and that's where the battleship Oregon was. Well, they had to sell it for scrap, and Portland kids, at least the story he told me, was that they raised the money, but all they could afford was the tower from the battleship Oregon. So we have some of it, but not quite all of it. So that's one of those things. That's one of the stories of loss. Yeah. personally.
Hi. I've been doing playgrounds in Portland for 50. I've been doing playgrounds in Portland for 50 years, and I was involved in designing and manufacturing the playground at Peninsula Park and the Rose Garden Children's Park, and the furniture at the Lonsdale and Chapman Parks, and many other parks. And playgrounds today, with programming, can be so much more than we're doing in Portland. And on playgrounds today, we're doing maps and art and sculpture and kinetic spaces that you can go on in historical cities. We've done playgrounds that have six different themes, playgrounds based on trains. And that's all part of educating and exciting the public and the kids. So Portland doesn't do a very good job on doing that. We have an idea for including art in the playground, but changing art and sculpture and things like that to involve kids on that level. So a lot more can be done.
Fair enough. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today. Special thanks to Catherine, Jason, and Dave. Thank you, Oregon Historical Society. I hope tomorrow or the next day or on the weekend you go to a park and you think differently about it. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone. We'll keep the store and the exhibition open for a few more minutes, so make yourselves comfortable and enjoy.